Okay. All right. So we missed David's introduction, but
I'll
you
do it
didn't
again.
miss
I'm David
much.
Levitas, Executive Director of LA Ford Institute. Really excited about social housing and even more excited about Report Forward, which journalist Alyssa Walker writes for LA Ford Institute. So, Alyssa?
Thank you, David. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this hot night. Like we said, hopefully you're somewhere cool. And this is, I guess it's kind of a good framework for what we're talking about, because the whole point of models like social housing is that we build better housing. And that also includes the infrastructural part of it. You know, we would really think of houses that are climate proofed for the future. And that includes the social infrastructure too. That is kind of that takes the model of social housing kind of beyond what the kind of housing that we build now in the city. So I wanted to talk quickly just about what we do for Report Forward. I'm going to share my screen just so you can get a little preview of what we do. Can everybody see that thumbs up? So this is, if you go to the LA Ford Institute page, you can see the URL there. This is where we have all the issues of Report Forward. Like David said, we've been doing this for a little over a year. And you can see the topics that we focus on are really it's based upon reports. So it's based upon like data and studies and papers and what people are producing to kind of point a path forward in city/county. And what we try to do is kind of get inside a policy issue and interview the people who are, doing the research, have these ideas, are trying to push these things forward. And then we kind of track them as they make their way through the various hurdles of government. Sometimes they're hurdles, sometimes they're not as many hurdles. So you can see some of the topics we've covered have been, I think this was a very popular one, like unarmed crisis response. This, I think a lot of people join a group that's an unarmed responder group that meets every week. And this was like a really amazing opportunity to kind of hear from them. This is the LA Forward kind of formed group, and it's really cool. It was really cool to hear from them about how they're pushing some of these policies forward. We covered things like climate issues, like this was about water, about after it rained a lot. We have kind of an effort to reform Measure W, which a lot of you probably voted for a few years ago, but it hasn't been rolled out in a way that we're really seeing changes. And so there's some reforms being proposed to it that might be make it a little bit changes happen faster. Oh, whoops, I'm going back here. And this is the most recent issue. We talked about governance reform. We've talked about the budget. This is the most recent issue, which was pretty cool to report because it was slightly different in that it's really just based upon one report that was created by the organization that has been taking all these leaders to Vienna. This is the Global Policy Leadership Academy. And one of the people who got to go on one of these trips was David. So what I thought was really cool, would be really cool to start it, is he has his photos from the trip that he shared with me so we could illustrate the piece. And I was just gonna kind of flip through them because I feel like they're very gorgeous and very, they make you kind of start to dream a bit about what we can do. And then I'll have him talk about his experience, and then we'll talk about the report, all the major definitions, all the things that you need to know. And then we'll close with some real world stuff that's happening, and then talk about, what we can all do and take some questions. So I'm going to stop sharing here and flip over to My Vienna Vacation by David. So
I don't know about vacation, but it was a good trip. So I went. There was two cohorts that went last May, and I was on the second one without all the elected officials. And I think what was really notable and about, it was not a tourist trip. I went to a bunch of museums the first day after I got there, but otherwise, it was like all social housing all the time. And one thing you kind of notice is like just the wide variety of the social housing. I mean, there's like different, like it's built by different entities and owned by different entities, but also just like architecturally and like when in time it was built and so many things. I mean, there's built like new social housing that looks different from the other new social housing. But what you're seeing here is a place called Karl Marx House, and it's one of the first, if not the first, social housing projects in Vienna, and it was built as a result of the Red Vienna period, where after World War I and the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which Vienna was the capital of, one of the capitals of, basically a very left-wing government took over, was elected, and started. The housing conditions were miserable. I mean, like worse than LA today. I mean, and certainly rampant homelessness and disease, and terrible. And they started by building this Karl Marxhof, and they built it. They made sure to build it in a well-off neighborhood. So and so this, you can see, it's like old buildings, but still people still live here. It's very well maintained. So you can see this is like, it's a very large building, very large complex, but you can see it's like there's a nice courtyard in the middle of lots of trees. This is on the outside of it. You can see tree-lined streets. Again, very well maintained, even though it's like 100 plus years old. And yeah, this is a bunch of us on the tour. Yeah, it looks like it almost could be a park, but it's actually the center of government-owned housing.
And that's really, I think, the through line, just notice in the photos, is like green space is such a big part of every development. It's not the same way that we are building our housing here, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So this is again same development. This is like, there's a big kind of tunnel. This is looking outwards. And one thing that's really interesting, you see this red print. Every single, certainly the publicly owned, the municipally owned housing in the city of Vienna, which is about 25% of the housing stock, it has these big red letters on it. Like, they're proud of it. It's like, this is public housing. This is what you're seeing here on the screen. This is very iconic. This was built in, I think, the 60s. And this is like, most of their social housing is like, gentle densities, 7 to 10 stories, maybe less. This is like 25 stories tall, but it's like very popular, and like, it's like, it goes up, it goes in as it goes up. And so like the first half of them is like, you have these like balconies, and people are growing all kinds of stuff, which is really, it's pretty spectacular in person. And it's right next to like near a metro stop, as most of these are, because they have a great metro system and tram system. So yeah, it's just lush. Of course, we're there in May, so it's a nice time of year. Like, maybe it doesn't look as nice in December when it's all gray, but it's you get the vibe. And there's like multiple ones of these buildings with all around like green space. Again, common theme, like green space, green space, green space. Here is, like, you can see this, that is, I believe, I could be wrong, that building, which is this is a view out the boat from the river down the middle of the city, like that is social housing. That, like, looks all fancy, but that's social housing. This is also social housing. So this is another day we went to like the outskirts of the city and a former air yard. I think it might have been military yard. And so they're building basically like, it's a planned community from scratch. So this whole thing was built from the ground up. And the vast majority of the housing there is social housing. There's some market rate stuff too. But like, they literally built an artificial lake. They built all these buildings. And this is like a playground type equipment in the middle. And you can see the trees aren't as tall, right? Because it's newer. It's like, they're still building some of it. It's not even, that's a ping pong table like built into the earth outside. So it's pretty cool. And you get a sense of like, oh, they're still doing this. This is not something that just happened in the past. Like, and one of the things that really distinguished Vienna from even other European cities is that instead of selling off their housing stock or abandoning it in the 80s, 90s during a neoliberal era, like they did stop building publicly owned housing, but they kept investing in publicly owned housing, and they kept building new kind of like new social housing that was owned by cooperatives or limited equity companies that were not primarily driven by profit. So, and now they've restarted building public housing again.
Wow. Did I leave that, or did you?
You did.
Okay. Apologies. I'm going to blame the overtaxed group.
Oh, it's Godfrey. You're there, Alyssa? Yeah. So
Okay.
this is more of this is that new on the outskirts, but again, there's a train line right there. There's a train line that stops like right in this new development on the outskirts. So yeah, look at this sidewalk. It's huge. Look at all these trees they planted. And this is the group, and this is like the artificial lake they're building at the center of it. Again, they've only built half this development. So the other half. This is the part they built. The other half is also gonna have housing. That's me. In case there's any question what I look like. It's also me. This is I think this is a different neighborhood, but I could be wrong about it. Again, like you wouldn't a lot of times like the social housing, the forms of social housing are mixed in. So like in one development, there might be some municipally owned and some cooperative owned and some limited liability company owned and some market rate. Yeah, this is a different development closer to the city center. And it's been around for a little while longer. So you see, it's like not small, but again, like there's communal space, there's
I love
benches.
that table. Yes.
This isn't like fenced off from the rest of the city. None of these are. Like you can come and go. Like you can't necessarily even tell by looking at a building, like, is it social housing or isn't it?
Mhm.
Like, in fact, so yeah, it's pretty spectacular to be able to see that. There's like critical mass.
Yeah, critical mass meeting.
Yeah.
So yeah, a
So
lot of bikes.
So here, this was maybe my favorite. So this is also new development. And this was a development that was built in the central heart of Vienna, where it used to be a rail yard. And so this used to be a rail yard. And what they did, it was about, I don't know, 350 acres. So like 50% larger than the soon to be closed Santa Monica Airport. And it was like kind of a wide, tall, long, but narrow. And they built a park down the middle. They built a lot of playgrounds. They built a school on the side. There's some communal facilities. And then all along the sides, they built a variety of housing. And so they have a law, 2/3 of, if you rezone existing and commercial industrial land, 2/3 now has to go to social housing. So like 2/3 of this is social housing, a combination of government built and cooperative. And there's market rate mixed in with it. And so it's just an amazing experience. Like you see the kids are out playing and like, it's just so, it's one of our guides, just like so well integrated. It's a tram that goes through the middle, like a train type thing.
Oh yeah. Right.
Yeah, you see the train. And again, like these trees aren't that tall because it's relatively new. It's built over the last few years. But I can
bikes.
Yeah. And if you you can look it up if you just Google that's the name of the I'll put it in the chat. It's the district. And there's all kinds of interesting English language resources about it. Yeah. And this is again government built. So this building is something that we featured prominently in the report forward. It's this is like a cooperative owned, and it's called Gleis 21. And a group of people got together. I think it was 21 families. Maybe that's why it's called 21. And they built this building. And it's like high wood construction. A lot of it was prefab. But again, you see it's spectacular. That's me. And the building next to it that you're seeing right here is actually market rate. And so, a lot of times like the social housing is nicer. And this in particular, like this cooperative housing, this was almost all families. And they really made an effort to, there's like a sense of ownership but people can come, they can start it out and they can leave and sell their share for less than market value to new people. So this is the top floor of this Gleis 21 cooperative, and the whole top floor is communal space. This is the communal kitchen, and so you can just like sign up to use it if you want to have like a celebration or whatever. It's just there. It's pretty cool. And they have a book. This is a communal library on the top floor. Yeah. This is part of the same development. You can see like they really made sure to build like a lot of basically a car-free pedestrian bike zone, connecting a lot of the buildings. And they made this mixed use. And that's, they do that a lot. Some of the early social housing, they didn't, but a lot of these, like they built shops on below, and they make sure to build school facilities into it if they need new schools and that sort of thing.
Santa Monica Airport. Let's envision it.
And this is this same area. Again, this huge park going down the middle.
I just love this building. It's so nice looking.
This is Gleis 21. Yeah, it's pretty nice.
Yeah. There's a tram.
Train.
Okay.
Yeah. People walking.
Oh, now we're back into my content, my summer vacation.
Yeah, really, LA 84. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's talk about, I think one thing that would really help now is, well, before we get into the report, David, you helped me like kind of craft, I think what was the best like definition of and kind of talk through that the way you define it, because I think it's like a really, and I can put up the words so you could see it, but
Yeah.
I think it was like a really good way of having people understand like what we're going for here.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm gonna put it in the chat too. Um, so it's interesting. Like, there's so many different definitions of social housing. I think, I think like at a minimum, it's supposed to be permanently affordable. Like, one of the big flaws of our current system in the U.S. is like our affordable housing. Like, it expires after 35 or 55 or even 99 years. And like Vienna, one of their great successes is like the housing they built in 1920 is still permanently affordable. And it's under community control, which can mean a lot of things. It could mean owned by the government, it could be owned by a nonprofit, a cooperative, but it's not owned by like a profit making any entity that has profit at its unlimited profit as its main purpose. It's generally mixed income. So like it's not just for the poorest of the poor, but it's also like supposed to be have a wide range of income, accessible to a wide range of incomes. And then related to community control, it's not ever supposed to go back on the market again. So that's really important. And I think I remember, LA Forward's part of Act LA. Like, we had really conversations about how do we want to define social housing? Like, we want to build social housing in Los Angeles County. Like, should it be owned by the government? And I think a lot of us had the feeling like that we all have seen the downsides of like public housing in America, which you could argue the public housing that we built in America in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, like one could argue it is social housing. It just we there has some early successes, especially in places like New York, and then it was massively underinvested in and used as a tool for ghettoization, warehousing the poor, and for further racial segregation, and underinvested in big time. But like it was social housing, but it wasn't. It was kind of we didn't fully live up to the potential of what social housing is, and I think the feeling among like a lot of the LA movement groups, certainly those in Act LA, were like, we want to make sure this housing um, isn't just like owned by the government, but like it's actually tenant run and tenant managed. And so we wanted to place an emphasis on like, okay, we want to use government owned land because it's cheap to acquire, but we want the housing itself to be like controlled by like a CLT, or some kind of community organization, and we want the residents to have owner like to have a role in managing it, so they're not just like their corporate landlord isn't just replaced with some massive bureaucracy that also is not accountable to them and ensuring their well-being. Um, and so, yeah, so that's a decision that I think maybe not everybody in LA agrees with, but certainly like a lot of the groups we work with were really keen on doing.
Yeah, I think the definition is it's broad, but and can mean a lot of things. And then Godfrey dropped in a really great link too, which is what I think what we're working with, through in to just for the LA framing is how Act LA has defined it, and a lot of the definitions are there that you can check out. And then this is the link to the report, which we came out after I don't know how many. They're still sending people on these trips to Vienna, so you'll keep seeing like former council members and current council members and supervisors and housing folks. They keep popping up on these trips. So they continue to be taken, which is really exciting. But this report was kind of the first to tie together everything from an LA perspective. There was another great New York Times story, which I can drop in the chat, which you might have seen, that came out like last May, maybe, which is great. But why the report is so great is it's all framed around Los Angeles and in this particular moment, which we'll talk about in a minute too, which is really exciting because there's things happening on the ground. There's money finally to be devoted to some of these models, and potentially even more money depending on what happens this November. And I really highly recommend, if you are just the absolute beginner, the part I really love, the entire report is written in such an accessible way with very little jargon. If you can just read it, you understand it. This is a place just to get started, like if you don't know anything about it, which is, I think, a really useful place to start if you're just diving into the report. And David, I would love to hear your thoughts too about you know, how you saw the report kind of dropping when it did, and what it's kind of pointing out, and some reflections after someone who went on the trip and then saw kind of the takeaways framed here.
Yeah, well, I'll just say first, like the experience you write in a report forward in the issue about the experience of my friend Scarlett De Leon, who's a campaign director for ACT LA, and her just like she has a young son, and she's just like like tearing up, crying at like what she saw. And I also have a 1-year-old now, and who was not born when I went on the trip, and then a 3-year-old, currently a 3-year-old, and yeah, it just we live, we're lucky. We live in a nice neighborhood, and there's a lot of parks nearby and great, but like, there was something so magical about being there. Um, and just seeing like one, the affordability level, and two, like the fact that like you get housing there. Like there's an agency that's like, it's not like you have to apply to a million different social housing things, a lottery. It's like you submit your information, and then like they give you 3 or 4 options and you get to choose. And if you say no, you got to wait another couple of years. But like you get options, and it is and if you have like, if you're in special circumstances, you're a single parent or whatever, like they can even like there's even lower cost options that are made available to you. And so that's incredible. And then just to see it, like there's a video on their website of like the kids playing, and there's just something so beautiful about it. And like they can play in this park that's like, or there's other social housing where they can play in the courtyard and not have to worry about like getting hit by cars. Like I live on a residential street, but the cars go so fast, like I have to tightly hold my son's hand as we walk through the park, like, which is 5 minutes away. We're very lucky, it's a nice park, but like it was really emotional. I think, to your question, Alyssa, what was your question? It was I just got lost in a rhapsody
No,
here.
I think that's great. Just saying
Yeah.
reflections on, I guess what the main points were of the report and how they were at
Yeah.
the time they're surfaced.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's like you're struck by being in Vienna, which is like the whole system is different. One, they have a very robust like social welfare system. Two, this whole like they've oriented their whole housing system around this, right? Like 50% of their housing stock is social housing. They've been doing this for over 100 years, with exception of the 12 years of fascism, 1933 to 45, and genocide. But they uh yeah, they've just like been steadily building it, and it's like funded by what used to be funded by a tax on luxury goods when it started. Now it's funded by like a 1% tax on incomes at the city region level. And so it's just like the whole system is set up in a different way, and like they have a land bank to acquire land like decades in advance, and like everything is set up to facilitate this. But I think there are some really valuable lessons. Like when this report came out, it was almost more than a year later, but like we are currently, working to use ULA money, LA City measure ULA money to do social housing. And like that's a fight. Got to fight with the city housing department because they don't really get social housing. They're used to their existing model of affordable housing that, the affordability expires after 55 years or whatever. Like there's certain things that like, we're now fighting to pass Measure A, which can fund social housing. But even once we pass it, we're going to have to fight to make sure like that gets funded rather than just traditional affordable housing, which has its, it has its place, but it has its flaws. And so I think it's really valuable, this report, and the experience for all these electeds and policymakers and organizers and advocates who went on these trips is like, oh, another world is possible, basically. Like it says, because Vienna was in such a bad situation a year ago. I mean, a century ago, and now they're like the most livable city in the world. And I think obviously they have their history, not just of kind of participation in the Holocaust, but like there's real racism against like refugees and immigrants, non-white immigrants to Austria. And you can't get social housing if you're not an EU citizen. So like it's not flawless. But I will say this, like if you are an EU citizen, like you get it. And I think even if you're a permanent resident, you can get access to it pretty quickly. And what's interesting there, to your question in the chat, Lauren, is like they for better or for worse, they encourage social mixing. So they actually don't want like a Chinatown to form or a Little Italy or anything like that. Instead, they spread people out, and they don't really collect racial or ethnic data, partly because their history of involvement in the Nazi genocide. Like, so they don't actually have great data on it. Like, there's clear racism there. People, some folks on our trip experienced it directly when they were there, but they this whole system is set up to succeed in many respects. And I think one of the challenges, of bringing some of the lessons of Vienna to a place like Los Angeles is like just the whole, like, yes, we have a land bank now in LA County, but like we're starting now, not 100 years ago. Like there's so many things where it's like we have not, they have this whole system of like limited equity, limited profit companies, nonprofits that build this housing. Like we don't have that robust system. We have affordable housing developers who can be very good, but they aren't used to working with cooperatives. So it's just like the ecosystem's totally different. And I think what this report did a pretty good job of, and I bet this is why it took a while for it to come out, is like they had to like figure out how do we explain genuinely like what is going on in Austria, in Vienna on the ground, and the cooperatives and limited profit housing and all of that. And how do we like tease out lessons for Los Angeles and for the United States generally? Because LA isn't really different than any other major city in the US. It's just like it's the context that's very different.
Yeah, and I would say, and that can maybe leads into the kind of where we are now with the process, and then we'll take. I know you probably have tons of questions, and people are dropping great things in the chat. But we are at this moment now. We've approved ULA. Some of that money is specifically set aside to fund these models, which is really cool. And the part that I thought was really interesting about ULA, which I didn't know, like, yes, we know how ULA is going to be, funding kind of addressing homelessness and housing, a whole broad spectrum of solutions. But what's really cool is that there's part of this that's about like education and training and like getting organizations which are could be the kind of the shepherds of this concept as it moves forward, because a lot of it really is like teaching people how to create the actual communities, like how to create the renter owned models, like things like this. Like we don't have really these things at all. So that was a really cool thing about learning about ULA. And then somebody asked a really good question about financing. I think that is kind of the big part that we have to figure out now. And I spoke with Councilmember Nithya Raman for the story. She didn't go on one of the trips, but she actually had gone to Vienna separately, and she's been pushing this legislation through the council, which needs to be in place to make this possible. Because like you said, like we have a housing department that tries to do things one way. We have developers that try to do things one way. What we need is a completely new way of financing housing, not just social housing, but kind of like all different types of models of housing. If we want to have some kind of flexibility in how we build and how we allow city money to pay for those things, because if anybody works in housing development, many of you probably do and can talk about this, kind of all the funding has to come together at the exact right moment to build. And if you're waiting on something, or if a loan didn't happen, or if you have like really high interest rates, or like all these challenges that we have now, it doesn't happen. So what is going to be explored, and maybe David can talk a little bit, he's been in more of these conversations, and what has been passed by council is now kind of directing the city to look at different ways that we finance and work with lending groups, institutions for all types of housing, which is super exciting because it will solve more problems than just building this type of housing.
Yeah. And can you say that? Can you say that in a different?
Oh, as a question.
Yeah, sorry.
Just your conversation. So this legislation has passed the council.
Yeah.
And then we can talk about county stuff too a little bit too, but like the challenges, I guess, of this legislation kind of, and what we want to happen kind of in the next steps.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the downsides of like LA City passed Measure HHH back in 2016. It was $1.2 billion bond for affordable housing, mostly permanent supportive housing. It was sold as a way to basically solve homelessness. And part of a lot of the units are getting built. They promised 10,000 units. They're going to get 10,000 units. A lot of the units are just built in the last year, which sounds crazy, and it is crazy given the scale of our crisis. But the problem is there was a decision made. The way in which most affordable housing, but not market rate housing, works in this city, in this country, is that you basically have to build like your capital stack. You have to bring multiple sources of financing. You have to leverage them. So like, I'm gonna get $500,000 from the city of LA, and another $1 million from the state, another $2 million from the federal government, and you have to like patiently acquire those, and like you have to wait for all those. And in a lot of for market rate housing, it's single source. One bank or whatever like gives you a loan, and then you just start doing it. And part of the problem with the way affordable housing is built is like different sources of funding have their own requirements. Oh, you have to use this kind of like these, whether it's labor requirements or design requirements or whatever. It's just like it just adds a lot of layers. And so one of the things they do in Vienna, it's like sole source financing or a much smaller set of financing sources and reliable ones. And then and that's what we want to do here in Los Angeles with ULA, and with Measure A money, hopefully through the county agency La Casa, which is just like instead of having to spend years bringing in financing from different sources, you have a pot of money from ULA and you just build a building, and you can do it much more quickly. And especially if it's on city-owned land with city money, it's like you do it, you build it, and then you have a project. And your money doesn't go as far, but like you do get the benefit of like building quickly and saving some money on it. And so right now we know that we've won at the council level. We actually the coalition has won permanent affordability as part of the guidelines for Measure ULA social housing projects. And the housing department's trying to say, no, we don't want permanent affordability. And so I think details to come, but there's a need to push back on kind of the status quo forces that are we just want to do affordable housing the way it's been done for the last 40 years, which we know is not enough.
Right. And quickly before we go to comments, one of the things that people might not understand, so we have ULA at the city, we have a way to fund this, we have a pathway forward. We also have this new housing authority at the county. I just dropped a link in for a previous report forward that I wrote about that. La Casa, you might have heard about it. It's basically a metro for housing. So we can now build things at the county level. And you talked about the county's land bank. Also, Metro has a land bank too. So there's a lot of interesting opportunities here with how much land that the county has, and deciding what can get built and how we fund those new models. Also preserving existing housing and doing some homelessness prevention. But what is going to really help fund La Casa is if Measure A is passed. And since they had the big kickoff today, maybe David, so we do a quick Measure A blurb, and then we can move on to questions and talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and I'd love to get into the questions. But yeah, Measure A bold new way. It's basically repeals the existing quarter-cent sales tax. It's funding Measure H and funding homeless services, and it repeals that, and then it puts in a new half-cent sales tax, and the money will go towards a combination of services, although new, hopefully improved with improved accountability, and the other money is going to go towards housing, toward fund this age, mostly towards La Casa, and we can use that money for subsidies to tenants, for fund right to counsel programs to prevent tenants from being evicted, to fund existing affordable housing models, and to fund social housing. And so it's really exciting, and we can do this not just in unincorporated land or LA City land, but anywhere in the county potentially. So I'm really excited about the idea of let's take the Santa Monica Airport, which is definitely closing in 2028. It's 215 acres. The current plan is make it to a park, but okay, there's a lot of parks in Santa Monica already. You could have a beautiful park. Imagine you could easily build 5,000 units of housing, social housing there. Not a problem to fit that in this. And so I think there's a lot of potential, and I'll put the link in the chat, but it's going to be a close one, I think. But so it's really important that we support it. And then there's going to be all the work and implementation to make sure the money goes to social housing rather than just regular affordable housing.
Right. Yeah. And I think I should also just mention that was the one thing I think that comes up a lot in, I always try to ask people if they know, oh, do you know what social housing is? Or have you ever heard of this, to regular people, not the people on this Zoom right now. And what's interesting is a lot of people said kind of what you said, don't we already have social housing? Don't we already have, why is not having permanent supportive housing, or this development that I know of, or having low income units, including as part of other, market rate developments, doesn't that count? And that's a really good question. And I think that comes up a lot for people who think that, that we've kind of already started to solve this problem. As Godfrey dropped in the chat, and something we talked about earlier is the affordable housing that we're building now expires. After a certain amount of time, it goes away. And you might argue that maybe we will have solved the problem in 55 years when, when it rolls over. But I think the one thing to look at the model is it's not based on need even. It's not necessarily based on if you're homeless and need housing or if you have a certain income restriction. It's really for everyone. And that's one way to think about it is the kind of the something that a lot of people mention is this mixing of incomes, mixing of backgrounds, mixing of races, like kind of breaking apart a lot of the segregation that's happening in the city, which I thought was a pretty cool goal for LA, even if it hasn't been completely achieved in Vienna. But the other thing to really think about is, if we can build these new models and create this completely different way of looking at housing, you have all these opportunities to really change how the built environment interacts with the city. So like the integration of green space, a new way of doing transit oriented development, putting like cafes and childcare centers and government services and post offices. Like think of how much of our ground floor retail is empty in the city. I'm not just talking about like vacancies of apartments, but like I walk around my neighborhood and see like so many empty spaces. And if you had like a community that was really caring for not just the people in the building, but also like what kind of things were on the ground floor, what kind of commercial spaces, what kind of green spaces, gardens. I'm just gonna, run through like a million things that I saw that I wanted to see, all relating to playgrounds. But we could really have a completely different relationship with the built environment and residential housing in the city. So that's just one thing that kind of really struck me. I know we have some questions going
Yeah.
back up in the chat. If anybody wants to re-drop them down, I'll kind of scroll back. There were some questions about what the organization is that took the trip. They're not just like a tourism agency for Vienna. I just want David maybe just address that really quickly.
Yeah, so like Lasar Consulting, they do a lot of work for a lot of nonprofits, strategic planning. They do work for governments. I know some of the folks who work there, some good people. They just started Global Policy Leadership Academy as kind of like basically to do stuff like this. And so I think they're riding the existing wave of enthusiasm for social housing. A lot of movement groups have been talking about social housing for 5-10 years. And, I think the people in New York who went to Vienna, like they had a good experience. I think one thing I was grateful for with Global Policy Leadership Academy was that they have a person on the ground who literally lives and works in Vienna. And so she's been able to cultivate all kinds of relationships. So the access we got to policymakers and residents was really spectacular. So I'm not cynical about, I think they probably make a little bit of money off this, but it's not, I'm not cynical. It's really great that they're doing this. And I think it's expanding the sense of possibility for people who are going. I want to get to Avishai's question about turning pre-existing housing into social housing, and it also relates to community land trusts. So there are groups like doing that right now, like in South LA, Trust South LA, for instance, like has gotten funding to acquire existing buildings, particularly buildings where like maybe the landlord was especially terrible and the tenants had organized into a tenant union against them and pressure them to sell. So that's one way. Or there's other cases where you have a landlord who's like generally been pretty good to the tenants overall, and they don't want it, but they need to get out of the business for whatever reason. They don't want to be landlords anymore. They can't afford it, whatever. And they want it, just like how some owners of businesses like turn their businesses into cooperatives and like sell it to the workers, like same principle. And so groups like Trust South LA, there's a whole LA CLT coalition. There's Liberty Community Land Trust. There's the Community Land Trust associated with Community Power Collective on the east side. There's one in San Gabriel Valley. There's like 5 or 6 in LA County alone. And I think many of them are pursuing this model of like, it's not just like building stuff from the ground up. It's like acquiring existing units and then from landlords, whether good or bad, and then keeping them off the market. And I think the challenge, of course, is like where to get the funding for that. But there has been, unfortunately, got cut from the state budget, but there had been a bunch of money for foreclosure prevention, and some of that was being used to, basically like we have this policy called TOPA and COPA, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act and Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. The idea being like if the landlord's going to sell, they first have to offer it to the tenants, and then if someone else makes an offer that's not the tenants or a community organization, that the tenants have a right to match it. And so like this policy has been around. Like the tricky part is like giving them enough time to arrange the financing. but it's like this is something that is actively being worked on by CLTs and some really there's a California CLT network. Like there's a lot of work that's being done on this if folks want to dive into it with people who are way more expert than me.
Yeah, we dropped some, so Sarah dropped a good link that's kind of statewide, and then I dropped the Liberty Hill one. Um, uh, and then for people who didn't join, I also had dropped earlier, like if you want to go, kind of see one of these places in person, that it was an existing, actually it's a group of buildings, the LA Eco Village. It's just basically like, 1920 through 1940s apartment buildings that they've slowly, kind of brought into this community, this intentional community, which is pretty cool to see. Melanie asked a question about if Paris has set up related programs to ensure local businesses and craftspeople have guaranteed space in neighborhoods with social housing. I definitely have heard of something like that. And Scarlett had a good story about in Vienna, how they were like grouping musicians together in certain buildings and giving them places to have like not just rehearsal space, but to be loud at a certain time of day, and making sure that like other people that didn't want to have loud neighbors, could have options to live somewhere else, which I thought was just really cool. Like imagine if you could, self-select into some of these communities, and have space to not make a community kitchen or,
Yeah.
rehearsal space, something like that.
Yeah, and I think like the cooperative model, which like wasn't part of the main thrust of the kind of initial social housing, which was like publicly built, publicly owned, but like, yeah, it allows for like, I don't want to say intentional communities, but like communities focused on a particular interest to kind of spring up. And I want to reply to a couple of other questions in the chat. I think, there's Sarah asked a question about like how does market rate housing compare? And the truth is, partly because housing is relatively abundant in Vienna, partly because they built so much social housing, and like people aren't as opposed to density because they feel like it's benefiting them. And everybody lives, most people in Vienna live in a pretty dense circumstance. Is that like even the market rate housing is much cheaper? Partly because they can't 80 full. And here's a big difference between our system and their system. Like in the Vienna system, you have to qualify once for social housing. Your income is checked at the beginning. You don't have to like resubmit every year. Your rents are like basically stable or going to go down potentially once the building is paid off. And so a huge amount of people qualify, huge range, which means you have millionaires living in social housing, but like that contributes to economic diversity and contributes to the political popularity of it. It's like Social Security for here. It's like you can't touch it politically. But it means that like because 80% of the people theoretically can join, go into social housing, like the market rate housing isn't nearly as expensive as it is here. So it's a real difference. And then some other things, like I don't think there's any difference, Abishai, in terms of crime rates, like because the housing is so mixed and they have like government-owned housing in wealthy neighborhoods, and like it's all the neighborhoods are mixed, very mixed. And yeah. And then, in terms of decisions that people like living in social housing have to consider, I don't think it's anything. Again, you have different models, right? So like, you're living in an apartment building, which is not so, so like who you're accountable to, it might be instead of being accountable to the landlord if you're causing problems, or you're perceived to be causing problems, you're accountable to your neighbors. And like they do everything possible in Vienna to minimize eviction, and there's like so much services provided, social services, legal services, but like it's not, it is but it is communal living in a way, right? Like you're sharing common hallways and walls and everything. And so like I think you're not going through the landlord, you're like and they have mediators. Like if you're having a conflict with your neighbors, like there are mediators, I think government funded mediators, like to help you.
That was amazing to read
yeah.
about. Like that's part of the money that, ULA is going to be paying for, is like training people in those jobs, which is so cool, right? So you're going to be working with people who, are going to be kind of organizing tenants, not like as a tenant organizer, but, getting the people who live in the building to, learning about how to create these communities, learning how to deploy social services, like all these types of things that, you don't really have that as, when you're just in your regular old, building currently.
Yeah.
Let's see another question.
Yeah. Other questions?
People feel free to response. Absolutely, Godfrey.
Take yourself off mute or put something in the chat.
Yeah, if anybody wants to like ask a question as a, as
a great question.
As a face.
So Yeah, when it started, Vienna's social housing was funded by tax on luxury goods, which at the time included things like movie tickets and alcohol. But I don't know at what point it changed. It might have been after World War II. It is now funded by a 1% tax on income. So everybody in Vienna pays 1% of their income. It's a payroll tax, basically. It's just like for Social Security or here, and you pay 1% of your income, regardless of how much you make, and that goes into a big fund. And the vast majority of that money is spent on acquiring housing, rehabbing existing housing, retrofitting it. That's another way they create social housing there. It's like it could be privately owned, and then the government will pay for like a climate retrofit, or like will add stories. And based on how much money they invest, that housing will become social housing for a certain period of time, potentially. And and then a bunch of the money is spent on new construction. So like instead of, unlike the US where you like the rent subsidies like follow the person, and like if you're in a certain kind of affordable housing, you only pay 1/3 of your income or whatever. There, it's like they use it to build new housing, and then your rent is never going to go up, basically, because once the building gets paid off, like you're only paying you pay to cover the cost, and the cost is maintenance, basically.
Yeah, there's a really cool report I just dropped in the chat by the Climate and Community Project that does really great reports on this, on all types of climate issues, and they are calling for a green social housing development authority. So basically, like a different type of housing authority that focuses on just building like social housing, but like those, climate proof structures and that we were talking about, and or retrofitting or whatever needs to be done. And I think that's a really maybe possibility now if we're talking about housing at the federal level, and how, Kamala Harris is talking about how she wants to build a lot of affordable units. Like, what if they were built through a federal housing authority in this way? And that could be, another cool thing that could happen. Again, we need financing also to change at the national level.
And in the original version of Build Back Better that Biden had proposed, like there was a lot of money for housing, for tenant stuff, and it got cut because of Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema and all that other terrible negotiations. But like that was in the original plan, and I think there's like a lot of and we had, in America in the 30s when we initially passed the public housing bill, it was actually written so it wasn't just like local housing authorities, government authorities that could do it. It was intended for cooperatives and unions and limited equity companies to do it. And we had seen that. Like some of the earliest examples actually of social housing in the US were not government built, but like were built by the unions, the government workers unions, and other unions, progressive unions in New York, and in particular. And like they were a great example of this, and they were in communication with what was being done in Vienna, frankly. And so I think, again, it's going to be a political fight to make sure like we don't just invest. One, we get the money for housing. Two, it's not just invest in the status quo, but is invested in models that are permanently affordable and under community control, and all these good things.
Yeah, and Sarah had a question about what building broader support, how councils, how to get sway over voters and councils. Well, I think like now the majority of the city council has been on this trip to Vienna. So maybe you have that's how you build a constituency, is you, start to make sure that the leaders are going to see it for themselves. The report is very persuasive to share with people. I think probably the only, you might have people who don't want government to be involved in housing, and then I'd like to explain to them how mortgages work. And how homeowners are basically subsidized by the federal government. But just to show you like how a real goal of the report was to kind of find common ground and bring together a lot of different voices, and kind of show where they have shared goals. And even Rick Caruso, I saw him speaking at an event, and he is praising this model. So if you even have, somebody like that who you might not even think would be really into social housing, he talked at length about how great Vienna's social housing program worked. So I think there are some real common ground to be found.
Yeah, and push comes to the shove, I don't know if Rick's actually going to support it or if he's using it to bash the current system, but it is. I think people are pretty frustrated with the current way of doing things, and so yeah, you never know when there's going to be like unlikely political opportunities that pop up. And the question in the chat about how does Vienna compare to Singapore? Posting two reports, older reports from like they're 6 years ago now. We read them in our housing book club at LA Ford 6 years ago. There was one by the People's Policy Project. There was one by a another group, a kind of a grassroots community group, by Right to the City Alliance, and it was comparing these different models. And it's, extremely different. Like in Singapore, I think I don't want to misspeak, but like there's models in Singapore. There's certainly models in like from like Scandinavian countries. There's massive buildings in the Scandinavian countries of housing, social housing. There's all kinds of interesting models from around the world. Um, and what I think Vienna is unique because like they've just been doing it for so long and they've achieved such success. Um, you know, but it's like we were joking on the trip. We are like, hey, maybe we could take other trips, but like there are things that'll be learned from places around the world and this interesting experiments in South America, Latin America. So yeah.
A great place to end. Any last questions? I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes if anybody has, or anything to add. It seems like a lot of you know a lot about it, about the topic as well. Anything, Godfrey, anything you want to add I know you dropped about some Measure A engagement coming up in the chat, so make sure to check that out if you want to. Canvas and Phone Bank, just to be subscribed to LA Forward in general. I feel like that's how those will pop up in your inbox. Will you get a link to the recording? Oh, check LA Forward calendar. Will there be a link to this recording? I think we can provide it or put it up somewhere.
Yeah, probably.
Any cities that are further along on this road?
I don't think, I mean,
yeah.
a place like New York, I mean, they have a massive stock of public housing, but the part of the problem, and this is where the Build Back Better money would have been useful, is they have massive public housing authorities across the country, including LA, but certainly New York. Like they have underinvested in maintenance. And so there's all kinds of problems happening. And there was a program 10, 15 years ago of a more neoliberal model of like kind of privatizing US public housing and using that to bring in more money to like do the repairs. So like we need to invest. To the question you asked, Alejandro, like, yeah, Mar Vista Gardens needs lots of help too. Like we need at the federal level, we need a bunch more money to fix existing public housing because it's not in the condition it's been underinvested in since it was built. So it's I would say in terms of like are other cities further down the road? I don't think so. I mean,
I dropped an interview with Seattle that has a person in Seattle who also went on the Vienna trip, who talks a little bit about some of the different cities and what Seattle's doing. But that gives kind of a good overview of some where cities are. But I feel like we're on the leading edge.
Yeah, I mean, New York is interesting. They have starting in the 60s, they had this organization called UHAB that started that is a real model for what ACT LA is trying to do around ULA, which is it basically works with and I'll post a link in the chat, called Urban Homesteading Assistance Board. Name is ignore the name, but like it's been around for 50 years and it's like helping tenants basically manage their own homes and like start cooperatives and whatnot. And New York has an example of like the very first graduate level paper I ever wrote 20 plus years ago was about Mitchell Lama. They have this middle income affordable housing program there that doesn't exist anymore, but created a lot of, covenanted units, and there's public housing and there's cooperatives, and there was a lot built in New York post-war World War II of like with union pension funds and life insurance money. So, we've seen, I would say that like New York has some advantages in terms of like it has existing stock. But I think what we're doing here is really exciting in terms of creating like dedicated stream of development. Like ULA, the fact that there was a part written in that's specifically for social housing is like a big deal. And so in many ways we're on the cutting edge.
Yeah.
And even the people who are like opposing social housing, the politicians who are opposing it here have to give lip service to it because it's in some cases. So not that it's not going to happen without a fight. It'll definitely take a fight, many fights, but I think we're in a really exciting moment, and God knows like the scale of the problem is huge. So, but it is, I think it's a really exciting time to be doing this work and trying to kind of enter a whole new paradigm.
Yeah, what I like to say, what Scarlett and I were kind of talking about when I ended the story is that we're hoping that the next place we live just isn't built yet and we can invent it. And then we can be the people who, can move into these new models and show how well they work. So That's kind of my goal. Oh, shopping. Oh, great. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, good example from New York. Anything else? Yeah, that's a great organization. Bad name, as you said. You have.
Yeah. UHAB's cool.
Yeah,
Homesteading is a little weird, but
there you go.
it was a
Yeah.
different time. Um, cool. Well, thank you for all of you who stuck with us full hour plus. And yeah, hope this was interesting. And yeah, if you want to learn more, LA Forward's been focused on housing since we started 8 years ago. It's a thing we always do a lot of work on. We're deep in the weeds in this, and if you want to get involved in the advocacy or you just want to learn more, like hit us up. I'll put my work email in the chat. David at laforward.org. Godfrey's here, our deputy director. It's so no shortage of people to talk to. And Alyssa, of course.
Find me online. Awesome. Thanks everyone for joining us. Please stay cool and dream of social housing futures.
Yeah.
Where we have like a little like a pool. A lot of them have pools on top of them and like a big amazing public pools.
Yeah,
so
there's pools in Karl Marx Hof.
Yeah,
100 years ago,
this could be the future. This could be the future. Social housing,
cool.
social pools.
Nice. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording on that note.